And as we have been seeing over and hearing over the last day or two, there have been any number of stories from those who were in the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center when those two planes crashed into them. And in addition to the stories of how they escaped, there's another angle, there's another important element. What led these people to flee? And what led apparently a great number of workers in the Twin Towers to stay exactly where they were once those planes crashed into the building, into the World Trade Center? How did they make these decisions, and why did they? That's part of the report now from our correspondent, Maria Hinojosa.
The onlookers, safe behind police barricades, release their emotions through applause for the rescue workers. But for the survivors who were closer to ground zero, mixed emotions.
I saw my family, my wife and the two kids. Baby that's 1 year old and the 4-year-old. And I just saw them and I was just running towards the light.
Benjamin Fogel was right outside the building when it imploded. So survivors come to terms with what gave them the strength to make it out.
The plane is making impact. It's just coming in, and it's like shattered glass. Multiply the sound by 1 billion.
Judith Francis escaped through some back door steps.
And you're like, don't look back, don't look up, just keep going, don't run. It felt like a thunder of elephants just coming.
Many survivors spent yesterday in shock. Today, for some, that shock gave way to anger.
If I made it from 105th floor, many, many more people could have made it down. And Port Authority was announcing over the speaker over and over again, everything is fine, we are secure.
In the wreckage, she may have lost dozens of co-workers.
People had a chance to get out, and people went and sat back down and went up to get their purse and went back, for silly things.
Downtown near Ground Zero, Maureen Raffoni tries to make it to her apartment just 1 block away from where the tower stood, with no luck.
So you're looking at not going home for 2 or 3 days?
She feels guilty these days for everything.
You don't want to be narcissistic, and be like, oh, my belongings, oh, my apartment is trashed. The reality is I'm alive, and those poor people that didn't get out, I just pray for them.
As the rescue workers file in, hoping against hope for more survivors, those who did make it through move into numbness.
I can't find words to describe it anymore. It's just the pain that I feel inside. I can't really label it.
For the survivors, theirs is a gift of life, but it's a gift wrapped in pain and sorrow. How could they have survived when so many others didn't? Maria Hinojosa, CNN, New York.
And once again, that eternal question of why, and for many, the question of why did I decide to flee, or why did I decide to stay? Questions being asked by so many people, above all the loved ones, the family and friends of those who were lost or at least are trapped at the World Trade Center site. Back to you now in Atlanta, Jim.
Garrick, just to chat with you a little bit and ask you, we see there the obvious pain, the wonderment at having survived such a disaster. But we also saw this day a lot of resolve on the part of New Yorkers, a band of people that, more than perhaps many others around the world, have a tendency to stick together in times of challenge.
That's true, and of course there's been this popular image of the tough New Yorker, the can-do New Yorker, at times rather obnoxious perhaps, but that's supposed to be this metropolis's characteristic. And one of the reasons for it is the sheer density of this city, particularly for an American city. Manhattan, the center of New York City, obviously, is an island. There are bridges going out on the Hudson River, the East River. People really live here in dormitory living. We live in cubicles and cells, if you will. And if you're going to live that close together, two things happen, Jim. One is you run up against each other and you become very abrasive. On the other hand, you realize that you are part of a community. There's no big backyard. There's no backyard fence or a driveway separating your place from the next place, like much of American suburbia, for example. And I think this goes a long way to explaining why people in New York City, particularly here in Manhattan, stick together, work together, and that's what they're continuing to do tonight and obviously for many days ahead.
All right, Gary Cutley, thank you for that. Colleen.
All right, Jim. Well, CNN has learned that a microphone was actually left open on the hijacked flight that crashed in rural Pennsylvania, and we have obtained a partial transcript of what air traffic ground control heard taking place inside that cockpit. While United Airlines Flight 93 is 35,000 feet over the Cleveland area, shouting is heard in that cockpit. Someone yells, "Get out of here." The microphone's turned off. It comes back on. Some scuffling is heard, and a voice again yells, "Get out of here." The microphone again turned off, and then when it's turned on once again, someone is heard speaking English in what is described to us as an Arabic accent, tells passengers this: "There is a bomb on board. This is the captain speaking. Remain in your seat. There is a bomb on board. Stay quiet. We are meeting their demands. We are returning to the airport." And the microphone then goes off as the doomed plane heads into Pittsburgh airspace. That into CNN. Well, the Federal Bureau of Investigation is conducting a massive operation throughout the U.S. The FBI Wednesday took several people into custody in Boston and Florida for questioning. Now, these people have not been arrested, or they're not even being described as suspects at this point, but authorities say that they could provide what they call important material information related to the attacks. Meanwhile, the FBI says it believes at least 4 hijackers were capable of flying a plane. CNN's Mike Betcher has more on that.
From Maine to Florida, the investigation moved quickly along the eastern seaboard.
We have, in the last 24 hours, taken the manifests and used those as an evidentiary base, and have talked to many of the families of the victims, and have successfully, I believe, identified many of the hijackers on each of the 4 flights that went down.
Federal investigators now believe they know the identity of 4 men capable of piloting the 2 planes that left Boston and crashed into the World Trade Center. The key, rental cars parked by the suspected terrorist at Portland International Airport and Boston's Logan Airport, each yielding clues that ultimately led investigators to flight schools in Florida.
A number of the suspected hijackers were trained as pilots in the United States.
Rental records for the car left in Portland brought investigators to residences in Vero Beach, Florida, which were searched by the FBI. Inside one house, pictures of Adnan Bukhari and a pilot certificate from a Florida flight school in his name. Also found inside the residence, another pilot certificate for Amir Abbas Bukhari. Another certificate indicates that at least one of the Bukharis participated in a program to help train Saudi Airlines employees. Federal investigators believe the 2 men are brothers and prime suspects. FBI agents also visited other Florida locations after gathering clues from the second rental car parked at Boston's Logan Airport that led to the identity of 2 more men, also pilots, Mohammed Atta and Marwan Youssef Al-Shehi, who received at least some flight training at Huffman Aviation in Venice, Florida. Charles Voss is a bookkeeper at Huffman Aviation who briefly allowed the 2 men to stay at his house.
They were, like I said, students, and they arrived over there a year ago. It was in last July. And when they first arrived, they had no place to stay. They just popped in pretty much, as I recall, unannounced. And so we provided them, for the benefit of the flight school, provided them a place to stay for a few days.
At least one person believed to be an acquaintance of the Bukharis has been taken into custody for questioning.
There have been occasions where we have interviewed individuals and come to find that the individual is out of status, and that individual has been detained on an immigration hold. But there have been no arrests relating to these hijackings at this point.
Having found the 4 men, federal investigators believe piloted the 2 hijacked jets into the World Trade Center towers. They are now scouring Florida flight schools, searching for the pilots of the other 2 jetliners, one that crashed in Pennsylvania, the other that rammed the Pentagon. Mike Betcher, CNN, Atlanta.
Congress and the White House are weighing their options on how to respond to Tuesday's attack. CNN's John King is covering the story from the White House. He joins us now live. John.
Jim, negotiations proceeding and progress being made, we are told, on two fronts. First and foremost, CNN getting details tonight of negotiations between the White House and key congressional leaders on what they are calling a resolution of resolve. But this resolution, we are told, includes language, and again, they're still negotiating the final document, but it includes language that would back the president in using force to retaliate for these deadly terrorist strikes. The negotiations went on late tonight, the White House faxing at some points proposed language to key members of Congress. We're told those talks will pick up in the morning. The president also making progress, we are told, in negotiating agreement on a $20 billion emergency spending bill. That could reach the White House as early as tomorrow afternoon. That would be a down payment on the money to pay first and foremost for the recovery and rescue efforts we see in New York and over at the Pentagon, and to pay for the early stages of the investigation. Jim?
Through the last years, there's been a sense that there's a terrorist threat that is looming there, and certainly the Bush administration has talked about that with its missile defense and everything else. It has pushed sanctions, diplomatic pressure, and other things. Is there a sense at the White House that the clock has run out on some of these options?
There certainly is, and again, there's both a short-term and a long-term prescription. Looking far down the road, we hear administration officials and especially key members of Congress saying the United States needs to go back to the drawing board, learn some lessons from this, find out what went wrong, and perhaps spend billions more not only on tougher airport security, but on human intelligence at the CIA, at the FBI, and at other law enforcement agencies. In the short term, Mr. Bush now trying to do something his father did when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait. Mr. Bush called more than a half dozen international leaders today. Secretary of State Colin Powell making efforts as well, trying to form what the White House is calling a broad international coalition against terrorism, hoping not only to have broad international support if and when the president decides to respond to these particular attacks, but also White House officials saying hopefully to bring some good from this catastrophe to create a sustained effort to go after suspected terrorists with military force if necessary, but also to get nations around the world to crack down and shun other nations that provide harbor or financial support to suspected terrorist groups. Jim?
You spoke earlier about some of the technicalities of obtaining the permission for the use of military force. How much coordination, how much support is there for the president? Are there sticking points?
Well, there are always sticking points whenever there is a proposal or a prospect of using force. Some in the Congress believe that Congress has to authorize it. The commander-in-chief always defends presidential prerogative, that he is the commander-in-chief and that the president can act to use force. So what the president hopes for here is to get language backing him, authorizing the use of force. He does not want to go to the Congress and say he needs the permission of the Congress, but what he would like, not only to show the American people there is broad bipartisan support for this, but to show other nations around the world that there is unity in the United States on this point. He would like, much like the Congress unanimously passed a resolution today condemning these acts, much like President Bush, the former President Bush, won support for his actions against Saddam Hussein. This president would like the United States Congress to be on record saying, Mr. President, if you come to a conclusive conclusion about who is responsible for this, please use force and retaliate.
All right, John King reporting there live from the White House. Colleen?
Jim, well, President Bush got a first-hand look Wednesday at the devastating blow suffered by the Pentagon, the site of the third terrorist strike. And for that story now, we turn to CNN's Jamie McIntyre, who's there for us. Jamie?
Colleen, President Bush did come by here at the Pentagon about 5:30 this afternoon to take a look at the huge gaping hole that was left when that American Airlines jetliner slammed into the side of the Pentagon. He thanked many of the firefighters and rescue workers and FBI agents personally for the hard work that they've been doing over the last 2 days. And as sort of a moment of high symbolism, some of the firefighters and other workers unfurled a huge American flag from the roof of the Pentagon, hung it down over the front of the facade as a symbol that they had gotten the fire under control and that the Pentagon was continuing to work as usual. But even though the firefighters finally did get that fire under control, they are now pretty much giving up hope of finding any more survivors.
There are still some smoldering embers in the rubble that was once the Navy wedge of the Pentagon, seen here in a commercial satellite photograph. But after more than 24 hours, the fire was basically out. The intense heat and smoky blaze that resulted from a fully fueled jetliner crashing into the building convinced Pentagon officials that anyone who might have survived the initial impact could not have survived the fire. The death toll, feared to be as high as 800, now looks as though it may be just over 200, including the 64 people on the plane.
From everything that we currently know, the estimate that's been widely reported is considerably high, and we certainly